Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for today's AIAA Los Angeles Las Vegas section meeting or e-town hall meeting. First, we apologize that there is some slight background from my end, and the music, space music. So I will mute myself, so you won't hear that during the presentation. So don't worry about it. Just bear with me for 1 second. So today we have very interesting talk, very exciting, and I have a great speaker. It's a very fascinating scientist, engineer, and he's going to tell us very interesting thoughts he has an analysis. And so just enjoy the event. So first of all, today is September 11th. So this 20 years ago, there's a tragedy. So we'd like to take this opportunity to mute ourselves for 30 seconds in memory of the victims. So now we are in a 30-second silence. Just let's pray for them. Thank you. All right, thank you so much. So we'll remember, we'll never forget. So in a sense, what we are doing here is to help people move forward. The SpaceX, Starship, everything. So let's keep going. So just some logistics. We thank you so much for the speaker. So we'll have the recording made and posted after the event. And also thanks to AIAA headquarters providing this wonderful Zoom platform. So if you have any issue of the bandwidth, you can try to use the dial-in. If somehow you got disconnected, please keep trying to reconnect. It should be fine shortly. So during the event, if you have any question, please type in Q&A box for the speaker, and the chat room please use just for communication with fellow attendee or the speaker. And after the presentation, during the Q&A, please click raise hand. You will be muted and welcome to have a very interactive session with the speakers. So just a few words about AIAA. AIAA is American-based but international organization. Our president is Mr. Basil Hassan. Executive director is former NASA executive is Dan Dunbarton. Our current section chair is Dr. Jeff Michelle. He's a AIAA fellow, Raytheon fellow. He's a PI with Raytheon. So our goal is to encourage, inspire, engage people, and so to help everybody connect each other, networking, and move forward for aerospace. So it's a huge organization headquartered in Western Virginia. 90 years of aerospace leadership from Wright Brother and Robert Goddard from the two organizations that established in the 1920s. So when you join professional society, you got to meet the experts, and you stay current in the field, networking, and you publish, and it looks great for your resume. So we have different level of membership. We have young professionals who have been called early career. They're actually also professionals. We're running the discount 50% off. And we have student, educator, which is free, and high school students free. So you can contact us or call the customer service and enjoy more and look at the website. That's just the website you have. Then once you join, you can immediately enjoy the engage. It's a platform. It was like a social media, but not exactly like that. But you can chat with fellow members, post your resume, post your activity. Everybody can share. That would be wonderful. And daily launch, you can receive a lot of insider stories. Sometimes you get great opportunities. Some of our members get business opportunity out of that. And also the very famous aerospace magazine is very well edited, very popular and very high reputation. And you enjoy great discount for attending national conferences and forum. It's a lot of saving. And we also have ARC for publication, AIAA Foundation. Blue Origin just donated 1 million to AIAA as a club of the future, is to support education for the effort. And engage, you just mentioned, and industry government. Career center, if you're looking for opportunity, change career, those things, is a great center resource for everyone. And we also promote, after years, you become senior member, or you have some great contribution to, leadership, technology, or different area or education. You can nominate, we can get the reference, nominate, and advancing the level of membership. For example, Mr. Elon Musk is our associate fellow, and Ms. Queen Shotwell of SpaceX is honorary fellow. And of course, our beloved Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, they are also honorary fellow. Dr. Jeff Rochelle, our section chair, and Mr. Steve Isaacovic, also Dr. James Worth of Michael Cousin, they're all, our great fellows. So we also have awards, like Dr. Paul Belalacqua, he was the inventor of certified VTOL engine. So it's got a Guggenheim Award, and Fujino, Dr. Fujino from Honda, he got the Reed Award. So it's a very important part of AIAA. And, student membership is a great important part. You have published student conference, design, build, and fly contest, rocket contest, and you can apply for student scholarship. That's only for AIAA students. So we have events such like Ascent in November to continue the previous flagship to network and learn more. We have also online courses. That's with many aerospace activity. Southern California is really center of aerospace. And we have new activity like a launcher space in Hudson, relativity space, Long Beach, more 3D printing, and many aerospace companies. Just amazing. So we have event like today and August 31st, we have struggle launch, and keep going. September 25th, we have Titan, the Dragonfly, and September 18, system engineering and the radar application. It's very just fascinating. So we also have newsletter. You can welcome to engage and post your articles, and it's a great opportunity to communicate. This is the article I was talking to Dr. Handmer. It's adaptive optics, laser Gulf Star adaptive system. We have a woman event, etc. We also have podcasts. So this is really important. We have so space thing is just so amazing, but sometimes people really just look at multiple news. They lost actually the most important part, or got misled by certain media. So today, Dr. Casey Handmer is going to tell us, his analysis and the thoughts about those. He's a physicist from PhD Caltech. He's also a software engineer, and he did a lot of this was a copious free time by writing about the industrialization Mars, which is a very exciting topic. He's a writer of the blog series Misconceptions in Space Journalism. And you can see his tweet and the website, and we post it on our website as well. So please enjoy this great event. So we'll have a lot of fun. So that's all for introduction. So it's all yours, Dr. Handmer.
Thank you very much. All right. Can someone confirm that they can see my screen? Anyone? All right. There's the chat. All right. Yes, can see. Okay, thanks. I'm going to have the chat window open here as well. So if you have any burning questions, just drop them straight there, and I'll address them as I go along. And if you suddenly can't hear me or whatever, do let me know. So thank you so much, Ken. It's a real honor to be here and to be able to share my interest and passion in this subject with all of you. And I selected this fabulous picture of the first test integration of Starship and the booster here down at Boca Chica. It's kind of hits all the right notes. And so what I'm here to talk about essentially is an elaboration of a blog post that I published about 2 years ago on Starship and why it's kind of a step change increase in. Hello.
Lower right corner of the slide seems to have some window blocking it.
Aha, that's the chat window. That's annoying. I don't have. Okay, I'll leave that off and I'll just check it from time to time. What was I going to say? Starship and stuff. It's a step change increase in human kind of launch capability. All right. So as you can see, I'm actually by coincidence wearing exactly the same shirt today that I was in that photo. I own more than one nice t-shirt, but not a whole lot more than one. So first of all, I have to be really clear and upfront. This talk represents my own opinions only. I work for JPL, which is a NASA center here in Southern California, and they have highly skilled media professionals that do the official representation of the agency's point of view and of the lab's point of view. And these are the people who you see talking on TV when the rover or the Mars helicopter does something really cool. And I'm not one of those people. I'm not officially authorized to represent the point of view of NASA. What I am encouraged to do is to share my passion and my joy for this subject with anyone in any way. I just have to be really clear that I'm not speaking for NASA. I'm only here to embarrass myself. And I also don't speak for SpaceX, obviously. And I don't want to be sharing, I won't be sharing any inside information. So here's a slide for some shameless self-promotion. As you can tell from my accent, I was born and raised in Australia, where I did a undergraduate degree with some research in theoretical optics. I immigrated to the United States in 2010, did a PhD there, focusing on gravitational waves. After that finished in about 2015, I moved over to Hyperloop One, which is pictured here on the right, and kind of did the design and analysis work on the levitation system for this test pod, which you can see here with these yellow pieces. And I also did a bunch of design work on the next generation system, which is kind of this patent illustration here you can see on the top right, which is super cool and super esoteric and also hasn't really been built, but maybe someday. Let's see. Currently, my job at JPL is doing science instrument development, software development for science mission instruments that use GPS signals. And I've also been doing a lot of planetary mapping. Again, it's super esoteric and focused. So I don't write very often about that sort of thing, but every now and then it will come up. And then just to be clear, this is not a grift. I'm not here to kind of promote, a webinar or something like that. It's free. Almost all of the stuff that I do online is free. I have a blog, it's free. I don't even put ads on it. I don't put ads on my YouTube. I don't put ads on Twitter. I don't do anything like that. This is just me sharing my joy, sharing my passion for this subject. And I'm smart enough to realize that this is not my main gig. So some of you will probably be aware of my work through my blog, aptly named blog.caseyhandmer.com. If you have a good idea for a better name that's kind of mysterious and cool, let me know, because I feel like it's probably time that I had one. I've been writing blogs going back probably 15 years now. You can go digging in the archives if you want to see. And they focus mostly on things like travel or politics, and then a lot of space stuff over the last 5 years or so. And then more recently, quite a lot of energy stuff, which I think is a harbinger of things to come. I've got a few more planned in that space. But the blog that I'm kind of here to talk about right now is this series, Countering Misconceptions in Space Journalism, that I kind of started, a while ago, and then it kind of got way out of hand. And so these are all the articles that are currently grouped under that area there. And then this one up here is the Starship article. So I'm going to be kind of pulling pieces from some of these other blogs as I go along, just to kind of make sure I'm telling an integrated story here. But it turns out that, space stuff is incredibly diverse, and there's a lot of really interesting ideas out there. And my particular background, which happens to be physics, informs a lot of these different areas. And so I found that I had quite a lot of stuff to write about. I also have a website, which I've just got around to upgrading to, like, only 5 years out of date HTML. So it's really kind of old school. But if you're interested in downloading your own copy of this poster here, or any of the other kind of projects that I put up online. You can find that on this website. And then I actually every now and then like take a bunch of blog posts and like smash them together into a Google Doc, and then put it online for free, and then also make an Amazon version of it, like a Kindle version of it, and put it on Amazon. So as of now, there are four books on Amazon that I've published. This one is very recent, just a couple of months ago. The first one was How to Get to Earth from Mars, which was kind of, basically a very long essay talking about all the different concerns that I'll be talking about later in this talk, which inform the design of Starship. Although I have to say, like, if you read the book, it's very clear that the way that I integrated those requirements was close to, but not really exactly quite like Starship. There are some key details that I missed. And then there was a chapter on this that talked about, like, what do you do once you're there? And that turned out to be quite interesting. So I wrote a book about industrializing Mars, which itself also kind of got out of control. It says how to settle a lethal vacuum in 400 easy steps. But that was a fun one. And then I thought, oh, I'm done now. And then the Misconceptions kind of blog went way out of control. And so I smashed a bunch of those together and made this most recent book, which I call Reading in the Space, because I'm allergic to good titles for things. And then I also have a book here on grad school and my experiences at Caltech, which kind of grew out of the fact that more often than not, like, I would say quite often, people would contact me and be like, hey, my niece or nephew is about to go to Caltech. Can you meet with them and talk to them about, like, how not to repeat your mistakes, to put it bluntly. And I said, yeah, sure, no worries. And then I realized that I actually had quite a lot to say about this. And so I ended up putting this book together. And again, all these books are available for free. If you look at the preview and you look at the first page, there's a link right there to the free version of it. So I'm not trying to make money here, but if you've got a relative or a friend who's thinking about going to grad school, or who's in grad school and is like, this is hard, this is one of many resources that I would recommend. I'm quite proud of that. Incidentally, I wrote that book in about a week, because my wife was pregnant with our first child and unconscious most of the time. So sat down and smashed it out. And then every now and then someone will be like, oh, you should write about this. And I'll like add another half chapter or something. And then I'm also on Twitter. So if you want to see me shitposting at various people or whatever, then that's where you find me. And then I've got, that same picture. I just only have a couple of pictures about space stuff. Okay. So let's talk about this countering misconceptions in space journalism thing. So throughout my kind of adult life, I've encountered public writing about space of varying qualities. And I have to say on the outset, most of it is very good. Most of space journalism by people like Jeff Faust and Eric Berger and so on, it's actually really, really good. But every now and then you'd find something in the more popular print media or something, and just like your brain would do something like the ill-fated Antares launch here, because it was stuff that seemed so obvious that it was wrong to me. But these things came up again and again. And, the kind of examples you can point to is like, oh, we can't go to space, we'll die of radiation, or like zero gravity will kill us all, or the aliens are going to eat us, or something like that. And so I kind of was just getting spooled up to write a series of incredibly snarky, negative blogs about this, being like, these people are terrible, what are they doing wrong? And then fortunately, kind of realized that there was a much better way of approaching this problem, which was to start by explaining what I don't understand about the problem, and then explaining why it's hard to understand this problem, and what the problem is about, and what are the different contributing factors to this problem, and then how we might go about understanding this problem, and all this kind of stuff. And it's just a much more productive way to think about, and a much more positive and constructive way to think about these particular misconceptions. And then as time went on, this blog got wildly out of hand. And then turned into a 150,000 word book. So it's just it's a nice way to kind of put down all my thoughts on a particular topic. And then if I get into an argument on Twitter with someone about it, I can be like, oh, I wrote a blog about it, check this out. And then they can read it. They can be like, that blog's terrible, but then at least we can talk about it, right? And people can write back to me and say, well, you missed this, or you missed this calculation up, or something like that. And I can go back there and fix it. And then it forms this static resource of information and links and concepts about particular topics that's very accessible and readable. And the overall objective was to kind of shape the discourse and to shift the Overton window away from these kind of religious disputes about whether or not Mars is better or the moon is better, and really help people think about these problems in a quantitative and rigorous way, so that they could, approach these problems on a footing of kind of skepticism and rationalism and mathematical analysis. That meant that, it wasn't really so much a battle of personalities. It was more of a contest of ideas. Anyway, and I will here claim like a small level of success in that regard. I feel like I've received almost universally positive feedback for this project, and some of the blogs in particular, I think, have really kind of nailed something, including the one I'm talking about today. All right, I'm just going to quickly check the chat window and see if people are screaming at me about something. All right, no one's screaming yet. Good. So let's talk about launch vehicles. Of course, everyone's familiar with the big ones, the more common ones. You've got Soyuz, we've got the Long March family of launches, we've got Falcon, we have Atlas and Delta, and the Space Shuttle and Saturn V and so on. And it's important to realize that all of these launches are incredibly difficult to build. If you think about that book that recently came out by Eric Berger about the early days of SpaceX, that is basically the story behind every single large engineering project. It's just dozens and dozens of, at least dozens and dozens, if not thousands of people really smashing up against the edge of human capability and human knowledge and struggling to make something work. And so you think about that effort, which is thousands, if not tens of thousands of person years of effort per launcher, right? And then you multiply it by the total number of missiles, which are basically primitive rockets ever built, which is like 650 different kinds of missiles that have been deployed. And then their descendant launch systems, almost all launch systems are derived from missiles, of which there are about 350. And you get some idea of just the unimaginable amount of time and money that has been invested in developing rocket technology since the Second World War, when the Nazis started building the V2. People have tried to estimate how much money this is, but it's definitely in the large single-digit trillions of dollars that has been invested over the last almost 100 years into developing rocket technology. And yet, of these 350 launch systems, most of them are not even on this poster. Most of them you've never heard of and would never hear of unless you clicked on this link and had a look at their website and were like, oh, that's interesting. The Scout. Most of them are defunct. Most of them are not being built anymore, despite all the effort that went into making them. And all of them are extremely expensive, and most of them are not very effective. Among that list, there's only really a handful of launches that you could call successful, which is to say they achieved every objective that their designers set out to do. And the Space Shuttle is not in that list. The Space Shuttle had 130 something launches and 14 fatalities, which is more than like about one fatality per 9 launches or something. It did not achieve those goals. So it's kind of worth considering that launches. This is kind of so obvious. It's you wouldn't even think to say it, but it still bears stating that launches are so hard to make that with trillions of dollars and tens of thousands of engineers working for a century, no one has cracked the problem yet. No one has really found a solution that you can point to and say, that's authoritative. If you just copy that, you'll be fine. No one has yet made the Toyota Camry or the Honda Civic of launches, where everything that comes after is basically, can be compared to on a sliding scale with the standard appropriate and effective engineering solution. So I think that's just worth pointing out. And people who kind of insist otherwise usually are trying to sell you something. And then here's this poster that I just referred to earlier, which is behind me. And this is crewed launches from US soil, going back to the very earliest days and then up to the last space shuttle. And when we have enough Falcon and maybe Starliner launches, I'll add another row. And I actually have a version of this for the Russian space program as well, but it's missing a handful of the early launches. So if you happen to know where I can get launch photos from the very early Soyuz and Voskhod launches, please let me know. That would be helpful. I ask around, and thus far I've had no luck. So first of all, we're going to talk about launch costs here, because ultimately the subtext for this talk is we want to build cities on Mars, right? But we're pretty sure we can't build a city on Mars with like, a trunk full of stuff. It's going to have to be like, many tons of things. So the amount it costs to launch that stuff into space and then send it to Mars is important. And so here on the horizontal axis, we have time, 1960 through 2030. And on the vertical axis, we have cost in dollars per kilogram. And it's a logarithmic scale. So we have 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600. Each division here doubles. And so we kind of see a scattering of launches here prior to 2010, which are between $3,000 and $50,000 per kilogram, with the Saturn V fairly far down, partly because it had a good mass fraction because it's a very large rocket, and partly because it launched a lot of stuff because it's a very large rocket, and the shuttle all the way up here, mostly because it was incredibly complicated. And the Delta IV Heavy, which is kind of in the middle of the pack here, despite the fact that the Delta IV Heavy is, by modern standards, unbelievably expensive. And then the Falcon 9 came along here at about, I guess, $3,000 per kilogram, and the Falcon Heavy about half that. And then this blue line doesn't mean anything. That's not how you do fits, but it is kind of telling that on this scale, the goal for Starship is somewhere around $200 per kilogram, and possibly even less. And that is, obviously, like, this is not like this. This is quite different. And in order to achieve that, there's only so much you can do by extrapolating from this data set. But obviously, something like $200 a kilogram is necessary if we want to be able to build moon bases without, bankrupting the world economy. And then the second half of this question is launch volume. So this is the total number of launches per year since the very beginning, peaking at about 140. Through most of my childhood in the 90s and early 2000s, it was about half that. And then more recently, it's kind of recovered somewhat. And the earlier launches were somewhat smaller usually, but on average, each launch is about 5 tons of cargo. And so as a species, all 7 billion of us are putting about 500 tons of stuff into orbit every year. And just to put that in perspective, 500 tons is roughly equivalent to the cargo of an ancient Roman or ancient Greek cargo ship that would be like built without nails or compasses and sailing around the Mediterranean Sea 2,000 years ago. So as a species, we're really still at the beginning here. Like, this is still extremely primitive in terms of our underlying capabilities. And in order to do cities on the moon and cities on Mars, this number doesn't need to just kind of go to like, 200 launches a year or 1,000 tons a year. It needs to go to like 100,000 or 1,000,000 tons a year. We're talking like many orders of magnitude improvement. And that is quite ambitious, I'll put it that way, to achieve that. So let's talk about logistics. To put it in comparison, compared to an ancient Greek cargo ship, which would be about the size of this name tag up the front here. This is one of the largest container ships ever built. It was launched earlier this year. And it has the capacity of about 400,000 tons of cargo. And so if we think that building a city on Mars will need 1,000,000 tons of cargo to completely replicate the entire industrial stack from scratch in a hostile frigid vacuum that's 100 million miles away from Earth, then that is 2.5 or 3 of these container ships loaded to the gills with machinery and solar panels and self-replicating machines and whatever else you can think of. And that seems like that's actually really difficult on 2 fronts, right? The first is like, obviously getting all that stuff to Mars is a pain, and I'll talk about that a bit more. But the second is, if we compare the city on Mars, which would have a few 100,000 people, to say Iceland, which has a few 100,000 people, but Iceland also has copious geothermal power and breathable air and fresh water and other stuff, polar bears. It's very difficult to imagine that, say, the government of Iceland could say, oh, well, we're going to stop. We're going to cut ourselves off from the world like North Korea. But before we do that, we're going to take 2 or 3 of these ships and beach them in the dock in Reykjavik. And we're just going to load up the containers with whatever we can think of to try and make Iceland a self-sufficient industrial economy, like, say, Germany or South Korea or something, or the United States. And you have to do it with only 3 ships worth of stuff. It seems like that's a pretty tough call, right? Compared, like, there's obviously a lot more stuff in all the factories in South Korea than you can fit in just 3 of these ships. I mean, these ships are made in factories in South Korea. So just to put that in perspective, so that's a tough problem. And then obviously 500 tons, which is our current annual launch, capacity, is equivalent to about one of these stacks of containers, right? So from like this orange one here all the way down to the bottom of the hull, it's like 10 or 15 containers, and that's about 500 tons. So in order to go from 500 tons to 1 million tons to orbit per year, we need to not just launch one pile of containers, but actually one multiplied by the entire length of the ship and the entire width of the ship, and then do that before June, and then do it again. So I like looking at this ship because it really kind of puts in perspective what the magnitude of the challenge is. And the thing is, like, this is an enormous ship. We can't build rockets this big with technology that we currently understand could even exist. This is not a matter of like, oh, well, if we built a better Raptor, we'd be okay. This is a matter of under known physics, launching something this size into space would not be possible. So the Starship is an absolute monster of a rocket, and it would be able to launch about 4 containers worth of stuff into space, maybe 5. And so, really we need to have thousands and thousands of launches every year. So I hope that that helps illustrate the magnitude of the problem. So I think at this point I will just I'll just check chat window in case anything has come up. It'd be nice if it scrolled the way down.
Yes, I think Dave and Dennis posed 2 comments or questions.
Is it only log scale because of the Starship rockets? No, I just took the graph from somewhere. But yeah, that helps put it on the same graph. Yeah, Dave, you're absolutely right about desired versus actual cost. Okay, and then thanks, Ken, for being my heat shield there. I don't mind. I don't want to get massively sidetracked by earlier questions, but if I've missed something obvious, it's a good idea to check it. So if we kind of collate all these different ideas and requirements, we kind of start to build up a picture of what the capacity of a launch system that's capable of building cities in space would look and feel like, right? It's not like, a slightly beefed up Atlas V. It's not a space shuttle that actually works. It has to be something that's quite a bit different. And so kind of collate these ideas. We need something like a 10x decrease in dollars per ton to orbit over Falcon Heavy, and like 100x compared to everything else. We need 1,000x increase in tons per year, right? So we need both a decrease in the cost and an increase in the capacity. And overall, we'll still have an increase in cost because we'll be sending more stuff. But the amount of stuff we'll be sending is a lot more. It needs to be capable of entry, descent, and landing on Mars. It needs to be capable of in situ resource utilization and a single stage return from Mars, which means it has to have quite a high delta V capacity in a single stage. And that also enables it to do a single stage lunar landing and return to LEO, to low Earth orbit. It needs to be fully and rapidly reusable in order to achieve these cost targets and launch cadence targets. I mean, I guess it's possible you could say that oh, we'll just figure out some way of making them really cheaply and really quickly, and instead of reusing them, we'll just make 10 times as many. That is a possibility, I suppose, but it becomes a little dubious, I think. And then obviously we need a very high efficiency engine, which in SpaceX's case is the Raptor. And there's this amazing picture of it here by Eisen Ramos, who I think taught himself how to do CAD by making this model. This is actually a model of Raptor. It's not a photograph. It's a CAD model. It kind of blows my mind. I have a 3D printer, and I was thinking of printing this, and then I decided that one shouldn't beg for miracles. And it's important to note that while most of Starship is kind of building itself around very generic technology stacks, we're going to take sheets of stainless steel and weld them together, instead of doing friction stir welding of CNC pocketed out 7000 series aluminum. The engine is irreducibly complex. It's irreducibly hard. There's no way of doing something like the Raptor engine without really smashing up against the boundaries of human knowledge and capability. And it really represents something that's right at the frontier of what's physically possible. And necessarily, a lot of pain and effort has gone into designing and building and iterating the design for Raptor. And I think the results, the demonstrated performance speaks for itself. It's the only full flow stage combustion cycle engine to have ever flown. And there's a lot of very esoteric technical detail about Raptor that I'm not planning to go into today. But again, this is 2021 now. There's many people online who have done amazing breakdowns of the technology that underlies this rocket. And so you can read about it there, I guess. And then obviously, even if it's capable of doing a single stage return from Mars, it still needs more delta V to launch from Earth. So it needs a booster. This is not a single stage to orbit capable rocket. I mean, actually, technically it is. It could, the Starship could launch single stage to orbit, but not with any cargo, which is useless. So it needs 2 stages to bring cargo to orbit. And so if you put all these different requirements together and shake the box for a while, then this is something like what comes out. And this is the model of the Starship /BFR /MCT/ITS, whatever they called it at the time, circa 2016, which is 5 years ago. And it has a large booster and then a large spaceship. It's got tanks, it's got header tanks, it's got steerable Raptor engines and fixed vacuum engines. It's got a large internal cargo and crew space. And then it's got this kind of fairly insane thrust structure at the bottom. And so this looks and feels a lot like the Starship today, with a couple of key differences. Mainly the carbon fiber primary structure has changed. But this is kind of what they drew out. And the important thing to note about this particular design for doing human stuff on Mars is that of the dozens and dozens of different architectures for sending humans to Mars, beginning with von Braun's Mars project, going all the way through Mars Direct, the 90-day report, all these other ones, including ones depicted in science fiction, such as The Martian or the Mars trilogy or whatever. This is the first one that kind of correctly recognizes that the hard part of this project is getting a rocket that's capable of getting from Mars back to Earth onto the surface of Mars. The hard part about sending humans to Mars is actually sending them back to Earth when you're done. That is the hardest of the parts. Getting them to Mars is also hard, and keeping them alive on Mars is also hard. But I think getting it back from Mars is the hard part. And this was the first rocket that kind of its design reflected that reality. And then there were, a couple of key technology developments that were necessary to make something like this possible. And one of them was the Raptor engine, which didn't exist at the time. And one of them were these very large scale carbon fiber structures. And so SpaceX set about, retiring development risks on these particular projects by building the pre-burners for the Raptor engine and testing them, and building large carbon fiber pilot tanks and testing them. And what they found was that the engine was a solvable problem, with a lot of headaches, and the carbon fiber was really a pain in the butt. And so they realized that it was time to change tack there, and they switched away from carbon fiber. And so, let's wave a magic wand and say that Starship exists and it works. And this reality, I think, is coming a lot closer every day. But when I wrote this blog 2 years ago, and when they first announced this 5 years ago, it was still pretty pie in the sky. But let's kind of talk about what its capabilities enable. It's a highway to the solar system, because it's designed to refill its fuel and oxidize it in low Earth orbit. That very high capability second stage, which gets it to orbit, is then a third stage, a completely refilled third stage. It can go again, and it has enough payload capacity, enough fuel capacity, if you like, to take more than 100 tons to basically anywhere in the solar system at that point. There are better ways of doing it, but if you needed to do it with just one spaceship, you could do that. Which includes landing on Mars, landing on the Moon, and you could land on Venus, though you wouldn't survive on the surface for very long. You could land on Mercury, you could land on any of the Jovian moons, you can land on any of the asteroids, all of those things, and not just land on them. You can land on them and then drop 100 tons of cargo out the side. So that's really a transformative capability, right? We've kind of drawn a circle around the solar system and said, if we can build a rocket that has 7 kilometers a second of delta V, then all of these can be addressed with essentially the same system. And that's really transformative, because it reflects a world where launch and cargo delivery capacity is post scarcity. It's no longer something where you say, well, what is the best Atlas V that I can get from ULA, and how fast can that get me to Pluto? Okay, I have 500 kilograms, so I'll design a new spacecraft from scratch that fits into that 500 kilogram capacity. It's a case of like, well, if the minimum spend is 100 tons, I don't have to worry about mass so much anymore. So I've got some numbers here, which is if we need 1 million tons of cargo on Mars in 20 years to build a city there, then that means about 100,000 tons of cargo per launch window. There's a launch window every 2 years. So, which means that in order to get 100,000 tons of cargo from low Earth orbit to Mars, you need about 1 million tons of fuel in low Earth orbit, which means that you need about 1 million tons annual launch capacity from the Earth to low Earth orbit. And then most of the cargo, if you like, that is launched from Boca Chica or from the Cape to low Earth orbit is fuel to refuel the starships in low Earth orbit so they can go elsewhere. And it's just kind of an exciting prospect. It really kind of looks beyond the era when space exploration is, a lot like climbing Everest in the early days. So this is my worst slide because I know you can't read it, but it's a delta V map of the entire solar system. And I found this. I credit it to a Reddit user, Curious Metaphor, whose name I don't know. And it basically shows the change in speed necessary to get between all the destinations in the solar system. And then this part, which you probably can read, is the zoomed in portion of the inner solar system. And ignoring the fact that, launching stuff to the sun is actually incredibly difficult. The hardest step in this entire, I guess the Venus surface is a pain as well, but the hardest step in this entire area, which is anywhere you can get within a couple of years of flying from Earth, is getting from Earth to low Earth orbit. That's 9 kilometers a second, and then from there to the Moon, even from there to the Moon and back, is less than that. From there to Mars is less than that. From Mars and back is less than that. And so, once, as Heinlein once said, low Earth orbit is halfway to anywhere. And once you have something like the Starship that's able to do 7 kilometers a second of delta V, 2.44 plus 0.68 plus 0.09 plus 0.39 plus 0.92, is a very small number. And so, it is possible to start sending Starships all these places. And if you're launching, a couple of hundred of them a year, then suddenly I feel like the planetary exploration program that's run by NASA and other space agencies should be much more around the idea of, well, we're going to send one every year. Your payload will be ready or it's not. But if it's not, there'll be one next year. So don't worry. Which I feel like is the only way we can really get past the current kind of cost and risk spirals that drive these ever more expensive and more time-consuming missions that have at best incremental improvements in capability over previous missions. All right. At this point, I'll just take a quick interlude to talk about fame in the blogosphere. And as I said, I've been writing blogs for years, and this is a fairly typical blog example. I designed and 3D printed a jet engine. And anyone who knows anything about jet engines will be like, that's a terrible design. And that's kind of true, but it's also the size of my thumb. In fact, it's here somewhere. Yeah, there it is. Like, let's say GE is not going to be calling me about this anytime soon, but and then I took it to a friend's place and we hooked it up to some propane and fired it, and as you can see, it runs quite rich, which is well, I mean, it's kind of what you would expect from a jet engine that's the size of your thumb, and I thought this was pretty sick, and I got 47 hits on my blog after I published it, and that's about normal, and if we subtract my immediate family, that's about 40 people out there who take a routine interest in what I'm writing about. And that's fine. That's my audience. That's who I've been writing for years. And that's kind of how I understand these things. So it was a bit of a surprise for me when I, about halfway through writing the series on random space stuff, wrote the SpaceX Starship's a very big deal, about the same time as the full-scale Starship mock-up had been rolled out, and got 88,000 hits. That month. It was a bit of a surprise, a pleasant surprise, but a bit of a surprise. So it seems that, I guess every journalist knows that if you put Elon Musk somewhere in the text, you'll increase your readership. But even taking that into account, there was something here that really is keying into something that, obviously tens of thousands of people are deeply excited about and very kind of interested in learning more about. And so that was a pretty cool thing to write about and to understand. Okay, I'm going to have a quick look at questions and stuff here, because I think we're about to change something here. Oh my goodness. Lots of questions. Okay. Can I talk more about the zero-G refueling technologies underpinning assumption for this architecture? I don't know much about it. I know that SpaceX got a contract from NASA to do some demonstration work in that area. I think that it'll be non-trivial, but I also don't think it'll be particularly hard compared to the magnitude of the capabilities of the team. Jeffrey Greenblatt, you're right about Venus surface number, but in terms of the gravity, but taking into account air resistance, it would be about what is written there. Brad, JPL colleagues starting to absorb the mission possibilities opened up by Starship. I didn't really address this in the mainstream of the talk, but it is my perception that basically the rest of NASA, including JPL, is being extremely slow on the uptake when it comes to absorbing the possibilities for what Starship can and should do for their programs. And I think this is actually pretty risky, and I'm happy to talk about it openly because obviously there's an upside, right? You can say, well, cheaper launch is good. I'll be able to launch my stuff more cheaply. And I think NASA has kind of finally caught on to this idea when the Falcon Heavy is winning contracts to launch stuff. And that's great. And also some other government agencies. But there's also a downside, right? And the downside is if JPL is in the business of building billion-dollar rovers that weigh 1 ton every decade, and that's kind of the mainstream of their business, and then the launch cadence goes from, okay, we launch a ton every decade to Mars, to actually now you have to launch 100 tons and we're launching it every 2 years. And the cost of the launch is around about $100 million. Sorry, like $100 million for those 100 tons. Then spending $1 billion on 1 ton of machinery to go there, when the delivery cost is 0.1% of that, it's about $1 million for a ton, becomes very, very unbalanced. And this is a problem because there's no one on Earth who can make rovers as well as JPL for $1 billion a ton. But there are probably dozens of companies out there that can make rovers for $1 million a ton that work just as well and just aren't made of titanium filigree. And so this is something that, obviously me and my colleagues at NASA who think about this in the same way are aware of, but it hasn't really filtered in and then filtered back out of the Borg, as it were. Al Globus has asked about space solar power. We might take that in the Q&A. Different versions of Starship besides lunar crew and cargo, maybe. I don't know. And Dennis Donovan says less applications for SLS. Again, that's kind of besides the point. Because Starship wasn't really built as a response to SLS. Starship was built in response to its set of core requirements, which are quite different from SLS's. And as a result, just because the Starship happens to invalidate the reason for the existence of the SLS, the SLS in its own way did that already. So that's a complicated thing. Brad says, I have a colleague who was involved in the 2020 Astrophysics Decadal Survey and was surprised how we're unaware of their Starship. Yeah, that's yeah, it's deeply unfortunate, I think. And to be fair, it's a bit hard for the Astrophysics Decadal to say, oh well, we're going to take into account the existence of a space launch system which is still not orbital, right? Hasn't launched, and what it says it can do is such a huge step change in terms of capability over what has been done in the past that it's impossible for us to really, take it seriously. And I understand that it's the Decadal's job to be extremely conservative in their recommendations, but there are sections within NASA whose job it is not the same as the Decadals, and I think they should be taking this a little more seriously. Okay, Victor Cook says, what stage of development is the Starship? Stay tuned. Dave Nordling says, Starship invalidates the SLS. Yeah, I have a blog about that. Okay, I think the commentary is getting slightly out of control here. And Jonathan says, will SpaceX be developing technology to create liquid methane on Mars, or will another company be handling that? I'm going to address that later on. All right, it's been fun. Let's continue with the talk. So I wrote this blog about 2 years ago, and now obviously everyone's caught on, which is super cool. That's why I wrote the blog. And dozens of people are now covering the build in South Texas full time. Like they're living down there, they're driving by, they're flying planes, they've got telescopes set up, they're streaming it. The capabilities of the telescopes that people are pointing at this thing like every minute and photographing and counting every rivet is really quite debilitating. I think at one point Elon said that like there are people on the outside paying more attention to the design than the designers on the inside. And then here's just a list, and I put this here in case anyone wants to pull up the slide deck later on, of all the Twitter people who I follow who are like actively following this build and commenting on it and understanding it, or doing modeling or infographics or whatever. And this is not exhaustive by any means, but this will get you started. And then there's obviously detailed threads on Reddit, NASA spaceflight. So I'm quite certain that by this point, there are many, many people out there on the outside of SpaceX who know a lot more about, you know, the intricacies of the Starship design than I do, which is good. I'm very happy about that. So this goes back to that question of Starship development history. So I think it's clear that Starship was always going to be a BFR, which stands for Big Fabulous Rocket. And various concepts have leaked out since about 2010. Like it's obvious that people at SpaceX have been thinking about like, oh, what does the big rocket look like since then? And very early on, it was just like a scaled up version of the Falcon 5 with a scaled up version of the Merlin engine. And then in 2016, we had the Mars Colonial Transporter and Raptor engine, which was this 12-meter diameter carbon fiber rocket. And then they scaled it down a little bit, switched to stainless steel, like threw away all their tooling for carbon fiber. And so what we're seeing, you know, in this trend here from left to right is active iteration and development in real time. And the other main change has been the aerodynamic features of the landing system. So we switched to kind of a delta wing, then to this like tri-wing, and then these flap systems here. And the kind of the design impetus behind that, which will change again in future. Like it's been discussed that they're going to move these flaps further towards the back of the plane, so that they're not in the supersonic flow regime. Also, the hinge is not in the supersonic flow regime. It's just about ensuring that the Starship itself is able to maintain control in a wide range of atmospheric environments, densities, so Earth on Mars or whatever, and mass distributions. So it might be full of fuel and have not much cargo, or vice versa. And if you've ever done skydiving, you'll understand why it's possible to do that with these flat things, because they're not generating lift. So the balance requirement is much relaxed. And I expect that we will see substantial kind of design changes going forward as well. But in the meantime, especially since they started building stuff down in Texas, really they're spending money to invest in the execution capacity of the team. So there's kind of this beautiful feedback loop between the designers who are like, I think this will be easier to build, and the people who are actually building it who say, oh, well, how about we do it this way? And then this kind of feeds back very quickly. And yeah, they spend a lot of money on hardware that ends up in the pile out the back when they're done with it. But at the same time, they're not pretending that they already know everything there is to know about building rockets, which I think is the fundamental mistake that gets made when you know, more traditional rocket development companies set out with like a list of requirements, and they burn down the requirements, and they figure all the stuff out, and they specify the design, and they specify the tooling, they hand it over to the manufacturer, and then they wait 20 years, and then they're like, why did the rocket take forever to build, and why when we launched it didn't it work properly? Well, it turns out that if the development system is robust to the reality of the fact that you will discover and learn about building rockets while you're doing it, then the final product will be better. Let's see. I talked about driving the overall design towards simplicity in manufacturing and low cost to orbit. That's the only thing that really matters. Obviously, Starship will dominate the global launch market in the same way that Falcon already has. And in fact, it will cannibalize Falcon. Like the long-term plan for Starship is that SpaceX retires the Falcon. And then it also enables SpaceX to verticalize in adjacent industries with higher cash flow, which is what Starlink is doing. And then I'm going to skip over this section pretty quickly because I feel like most of you will be familiar with it. But there's this amazing interview that Tim Dodd, the everyday astronaut, did with Elon at Starbase about 2 months ago. It was on YouTube. And just towards the end of it, if you look closely, you can see Venus and Mars above the sunset, which I think is kind of neat. And here, Elon kind of laid out the design philosophy that they're employing to build Starship right now. And the first step is make the requirements less dumb. And I picked the space shuttle here because it's really a good example of something where the requirements shot it in the foot from day one. You know, the requirement that it be able to do a single orbit and land at the same launch site meant that it had to have these giant wings, which were never really used. You know, like the capability these wings provided was never used, and the vulnerability that they demanded to the design killed one crew. So that's a good example. Like the requirements that went into Space Shuttle were way too, not only were they extremely demanding, which is fine, they were also perpendicular to, like not aligned with its primary mission, which was getting stuff to space cheaply, right? Like at no point did like, oh, well, getting back to the same landing site after a single orbit while the Earth has turned in the meantime, that's not aligned with getting stuff to space cheaply. And so it's not really a surprise that when all was said and done, the Space Shuttle ended up being really expensive and really dangerous. And so Elon just basically points out that it doesn't matter where the requirements come from. All requirements are wrong to some extent. All designs are wrong. So you've got to question the requirements. This has to be part of your design loop. The second part is try to delete parts or processes. He says, if you're not adding stuff back into the design at least 10% of the time that you've already deleted, you're not deleting it nearly enough. There's this idea that, we'd better put stuff in case we need it. And anyone who's gone on a long backpacking trip will understand this principle that, it's better just to leave it behind and not have to carry it all day and then find you never used it. And then he talks about having individual traceability for requirements. So instead of saying, oh, the aeroloads department requires blah, you have to have like a person in the aeroloads department who's responsible for that requirement, so that you can go and talk to them and be like, why is this requirement there? And this is something that's almost explicitly discouraged within many organizations that kind of do stovepiping and specialization and interface management. But I think it's really important, especially if you're trying to build something that's as tightly integrated and high performance as a Starship or a rocket in general, that basically everyone treads on each other's toes and everyone has a pretty good picture for the overall system design. And then step 3 is simplify or optimize. And he says here that like the most common error of a smart engineer is to optimize something that should simply not exist. And this is because part of the way we're trained is you take an existing problem and you just make it better instead of saying this problem sucks. And a really good example of this is the BMW i3, which was kind of put into production around the same time as the Tesla Model S. And in order to meet its requirements of range and cost and stuff like that, they went with a carbon fiber body, which then led to a whole series of problems with thermal expansion issues and the difficulty of modifying tooling and the expense of the tooling. And it's not like BMW came up with this out of nowhere. Many people, such as Amory Lovins of the Rocky Mountain Institute, had been advocating for carbon fiber structures for cars for a long time to reduce the total mass and reduce the amount of energy required to move them. Like, it seems like a good idea. But I think in 2021, with the benefit of hindsight, we can say that cars that were brought to market with a carbon fiber structure, it wasn't a net benefit for the car. And it certainly wasn't a net benefit for the BMW i3. This car has written all over it, optimized, but optimizing the wrong thing. So it's a good example. And then finally, step 4 is accelerate cycle time. So after you've done the first 3 steps, then you can step on the gas. As my father once said, if you find yourself in a hole, step 1 is throw away the shovel. Don't just like dig faster. And then step 5 is automate. And I think everyone loves robots, and the power of automated manufacturing is very attractive to people, particularly people in design space. But it's also important to realize that they're not a universal panacea. They're actually their own system and have their own complexities, and getting them to work properly is extremely complicated. So it's usually a good idea to start with something that works with less automation and then add automation over time, again, with the sole directive that you're increasing value and reducing cost. And so just to kind of compare this, it's not like these 5 things are 10 commandments that come down from heaven and tell us everything we need to do. These 5 requirements, or these 5 steps, if you like, are very easy to defend once you've articulated them. But if we compare it to other NASA flagship programs, which are essentially also spacecraft, so we've got SLS, JWST, which is pictured here, finally has a launch date, Orion, Starliner, Perseverance, and Mars Sample Return, and the Ingenuity helicopter here, which is pretty neat, and the Hubble Space Telescope. We see that without exception, every single one of these programs are big, complex, troubled projects that are hurt by unnecessary complexity. By the time this technician is integrating the spacecraft, he would know dozens and dozens of different systems and features on this spacecraft that shouldn't be there, that shouldn't have been done that way. But this technician had no way of feeding that back to the design engineer. They had no way of allowing that information to become known to the people who'd be designing the next generation system. They had no way of essentially allowing the organization and the system to learn. The same thing goes with the Mars rover, $1 billion rover. And then the helicopter itself was $15 million or something. Obviously, the helicopter is substantially less sophisticated in terms of what it's capable of than the rover, and much lighter. But it's interesting to me because it shows that it is possible to build a high-performance space-rated system. It's just done its 13th flight that can operate in the Mars environment for millions of dollars instead of billions of dollars, right? And so one of the things that JPL makes JPL really special is that even though their main business is charging NASA billions of dollars to make these rovers, they are able to, when they're making them on their own dime, make them much cheaper. And I think, it wouldn't hurt if, given the resounding success of the Ingenuity Mars helicopter, NASA turned around and said, well, we don't have any other Mars missions in the pipeline, Mars surface missions in the pipeline for you, except for Mars sample return. But if you can build us a system that can launch 200 of these helicopters, because they're really small and light, then we will give you $500 million every launch window to do that. And then you'd have the ability for hundreds and hundreds of PIs to build small custom instruments and spectrometers and stuff, and stick them on these helicopters and fly them around on Mars. And I feel like that would be a really good step in this direction. So a system summary, and again, Tim Dodd has a 1 hour long video breaking this down, which I cannot hope to kind of replicate in terms of its thoroughness or authoritativeness. But Starship represents, the first solid kick at the can, really, the first truly ambitious project to achieve the holy grail of rocketry, which is the fully and rapidly reusable rocket. Remember earlier in the talk, I mentioned there's 350 launch systems. None of them even got close. None of them could have gotten close. No amount of redesign work or anything would have ever gotten them close to a fully and rapidly reusable rocket. Starship here is the upper stage. It has a dry mass of about 100 tons, a fuel mass of about 1,200 tons, and a nominal payload of 150 tons. Combined with its high performance methane oxygen vacuum engines, it's capable of over 7 kilometers a second of delta V. The value prop is 100-ton cargo in 100-ton increments anywhere at $10 million cost. So, for example, when SpaceX bid Starship for the human lander system, part of the Artemis program, the contract called for a lander capable of 9 or possibly 12 tons of cargo. And SpaceX is like, here's one I made earlier, 100 tons is the minimum. And I think that contributed in some ways to it winning the contract. And I really feel like this is, admittedly a primitive and early stage version of a system that really answers this question of how do we get low dollars per ton and high tons per year to orbit. So why is it so important to have this, to solve this holy grail of rocketry? So I'm going to talk a little bit about constraints to space operations, because this may be less obvious to some people. But historically, mission and system design is incredibly constricted by mass constraints. When I say all of the Mars rover is a ton, it's a miracle of engineering that the entire Mars rover was able to fit into 1 ton, and that those instruments that they have on board, which are as good or better than equivalent instruments that take up entire rooms of Earth-based laboratories, are able to fit in that system. But this mass requirement in turn affects schedule, cost structure, volume, material choices, labor, power, thermal, guidance, navigation, control, everything under the sun. JPL is a kind of loosely flying, close-knit formation of like 500 or so subject matter expert teams, each of which has a different subspecialty. And many of those, most of them, I'd say, come together to help build something like this rover. And each of them is responsible for a different subpart of that system. And part of the reason that you have to have hundreds and hundreds of subspecialist teams is that in order to hit these mass and cost and schedule and volume and material choice and so on requirements for that particular subsystem, you need to be the world expert at it. Right? This is not something where you can go and kind of slap together a billy cart in the backyard out of spare pieces of wood and wheels that you stole from somewhere. This is, everything in this is kind of custom manufactured, custom machined. And so it's really, because it's hand built, it's a little bit like making steel before the Industrial Revolution. It was possible, but it was extremely expensive. It took a lot of work, a lot of muscle power, and you end up with a mediocre and a very small product. Like people could make a sword here or a cannon there, but no one was saying, oh, let's build skyscrapers out of steel, when the only way to make steel was for, in the Japanese case, for example, three very muscular men swinging hammers, smashing little bricks of iron back and forth, and building up those layers to get the appropriate material properties. And this goes right back to antiquity when the Romans were able to make steel as well, but very, very small quantities of it. And so Starship, the idea of Starship, if you like, lifts this mass constraint. The next generation Mars rovers will not need to spend all their engineering bandwidth tracking the mass of their subsystems to 1/10 of a gram, which is like the mass of a postage stamp on a system that weighs 1 ton. They won't need to machine the whole thing out of a solid cube of titanium. Like this wheel here is machined out of basically almost like a cubic meter of aluminium, and it's machined down to the thickness of a Coke can, which is one of the reasons that it ends up with these holes in the wheels. Why do we make the wheels twice as thick? Well, it won't fit on the rocket then. But with Starship, well, you could fit 50 of this on the Starship and have room to spare. So maybe we'll give it thicker wheels. There's also there was a design flaw with these wheels, obviously. And if you're a mechanical engineer, then I'll talk about it with you in the Q&A. So historically speaking, Bob Zubrin and all these other people have come up with concepts for crewed missions to the moon or to Mars, which have always labored under these impossible constraints, right? Even Mars Direct, which kind of envisioned something like 2 SLSs per mission. The amount of cargo capacity that was available to the mission, and this includes the Apollo program, is really like, you can measure it in increments of like what you can fit in the back of an F-150. In many cases, like in the Apollo program, the total like mass of the ascent module you could have fit in the back of a Ford F-150. And that's great. And I mean, it's wonderful that we were able to do the Apollo program back in the 60s, but there's no way to go about, it's no way to build a city. There's no way to go and build a city with 5 or 10 or 100 F-150s worth of gear. You need to be talking like container ship loads. And so it really takes time to shift perspective about Starship. What does your mission design look like when 100 tons is the minimum spend, and there's a discount if you buy more than 10 per year? And really, one of the things that motivated me to write this blog 2 years ago was that now that Starship, the mock-up had been built, all the usual players came out of the woodwork and said, oh, with a Starship, I could send my big mission off to Saturn. And Robert Zubrin said, with a couple of Starships, I can get something a lot like Mars Direct off the ground. And the moon people were saying, with a couple of Starships, we can set up a factory on the moon and finally do our ISRU demonstration where we make hydrogen or something on the moon. But really, that's kind of misusing the tool, right? Because Starship is not just like, we'll just build a couple and that'll be done, right? Starship is like, it's like the 737 of spaceships. It's like with a Starship, we can suddenly talk about a budget for material flows from the surface of the Earth to other planets that we can measure in thousands of tons per year. And so you need to think, and I have this fire hose of technology. What do I do with it? Right? I'm no longer like, trying to put out the fire with a cup of water at a time. I have a fire hose. What can I do with it? And it really changes everything. So one of the most obvious things that they're able to do with it is Starlink. And obviously Elon Musk and Warren Buffett had that public argument a few years ago about like whether or not moats were good for businesses. And Elon's point of view was, no, the only thing that matters is innovation and pace of innovation. And whereas Warren Buffett has often talked about the importance of moats that protect a competitive advantage for his companies in Berkshire Hathaway. But it turns out that, sorry, Elon, your companies have a moat, which is that they're able to launch their Starlink satellites. Talk about ambition. Here's 60 satellites stacked up. Like, you mean business if you're launching 60 satellites at a time for about, probably less than $300,000 per satellite, maybe as low as $100,000 per satellite. When the competition, OneWeb, has to kind of get launches on Soyuz at a much lower cadence, obviously, but also they're paying 10 times as much per satellite, and the satellites aren't as good. It's a really tough prospect for competitors in this space until someone else manages to do the reusable rocket thing. Communications is a much larger market than launch. SpaceX is basically already taken over the launch market, saturated it, which is worth a couple of $1 billion a year, with the exception of like Russian spy satellites or something. But communications is $1 trillion industry, and Starlink is really, SpaceX's committed effort to make some noise in that industry, and ultimately, encircle the Earth in enough satellites and enough bandwidth, they can run the internet from space. And then I had this neat calculation here, which is that if you assume that Starlink will charge about 10 cents a gigabyte, and each Starship launch costs $10 million, and there's a 10% profit margin, then the marginal profit to SpaceX for each bit transmitted through the Starlink network is enough to transport 1 cubic micron, which is a millionth of a meter of stuff to Mars, which is like the size of a small bacteria. So if you think like, if I stream some show on Netflix, how much cargo does that pay to me to move to Mars? Well, each bit of that movie or something is 1 bacteria worth of stuff. So once you've got a few million people streaming Netflix, then we're starting to talk about, hundreds of millions to tens of billions of dollars of revenue, which is a pretty cool thing. Then in terms of other low Earth orbit applications, aside from communication satellites, there's the suborbital transport. And maybe I should have talked a bit more about that because this is AIAA, but I'm kind of dubious about it just because of the noise constraint. I feel like, yeah, we'll see. Then tourism is very exciting because we've got Inspiration 4 going up this week. And then there's giant space stations. And of course, I love the idea of these giant Stanford Taurus space stations. And here, of course, we've got a mock-up of Starship and the ISS docking in space. And it's kind of interesting to me that the ISS took 30 years and $400 billion to build, and the Starship, which is arguably already capable of going to orbit, just not necessarily landing, hasn't been demonstrated yet, has about 3 times the internal volume of the, maybe 4 times the internal volume of the entire space station. So like that's kind of a really nice image of this change. And I think, well, part of the problem right now is that if you're the NSF or a private company and you want to do experiments on the space station, once you strip away the various starter rates and stuff like that, it works out to be about $4 or $5 million per person per day to do work on the space station. And that's a lot of money, right? A grad student on Earth will cost you about $20,000 or $30,000 a year to get a grad student to sit at a lab bench and do chemistry experiments or something like that. And so in order for it to be worthwhile to do the same sort of experiments, but in zero gravity at 1 million times the cost, that's really a tough call. And that's really why I think we have not seen an explosion of demand and usage for private scientific research or development in space. And I think with Starship, it'll be possible to build space stations maybe 1,000 times more cheaply. And so it may be possible to operate a laboratory environment on a Starship constructed satellite space station for more like Antarctica prices. You're talking like, $2,000 per person per day, or maybe $5,000 per person per day instead of $5 million per person per day. And I think that at that cost, there'll be many more organizations that are able to and want to spend the money on doing research in space on whatever it is they do. I have no idea what those things are. I think a lot of people have ideas about what that might be, whether it's optical fibers or something like that. But I think that Starship gives us the ability to empirically test the price elasticity of induced demand for low Earth orbit manufacturing, research, construction, orbital tourism, whatever it might be. And if it turns out that Starship is able to deliver people and stuff to low Earth orbit for a cost that's low enough that there is substantial demand for it, that would be super cool. And then that would be a step in the direction of these major space stations. Maybe I just can't imagine how that would work. I don't have a clear picture of how that will work, but at least we'd have the ability to test it. All right, so I'm going to go into lunar applications, but first I'm just going to quickly check the chat window and see if there's any, if it'll let me. There we are. If there's any particularly burning questions. Okay, I'm actually struggling somewhat to see the to kind of parse the questions on that. So I'll go through to Q&A in about 10 minutes, and then we can talk together about that. So lunar applications are the next obvious step, and here we have a really nice picture of Moonbase Alpha with some Starships unloading cargo. And obviously, like as of today, the Human Lander System program's in limbo as they all litigate each other. But I think it's fair to say that under the Artemis program, the original concept of operations, the ConOps, was deeply troubled. It struck me as being something that was trying to please too many different constituencies and wasn't really oriented towards building a system that would scale to being able to build a big base and operate it. Even though they did kind of say, oh yeah, it will do that maybe someday. But if you look at the responses to the HLS contract, it's not really possible to get to a decent sized lunar base with two of these different options. But it's important to note that of the three of these, the winner, SpaceX, has kept external development off its critical path. Unlike the other two, SpaceX doesn't have to wait for SLS to work. It doesn't have to wait for Orion to work. It doesn't have to wait for Starliner to work. It doesn't have to wait for Blue Origin to deliver engines to ULA, for Vulcan to work, in order that their mission can proceed, in order that they can bring stuff to the moon. Everything that's on the critical path is under their control. And I think that as time goes on, we will see that principle extended, and we will see, unless there are fungible and available systems in spacesuits, rovers, power systems, crew transfer, and so on, that SpaceX will spool up their own research and development in those particular areas, so that they're able to make sure that they're not depending on third-party suppliers who have a different understanding of the level of urgency required. And one of the key things to note about Starship is that even though in the HLS system, it nominally is transferring crew from the lunar gateway to the surface and back, it's actually capable of flying from low Earth orbit all the way to the moon and back without refueling, carrying a lot of mass. In fact, you could put both the national team lander and the Dynetics capsule inside the Starship, fly it from low Earth orbit to the moon, drop it off, and then fly the Starship back to Earth. And it wouldn't run out of fuel. Like, it has enough fuel to do that. And I think that's important to note and important to understand. And this is some calculation that I did. But if you fuel it in geostationary orbit, transfer orbit, then you can move hundreds and hundreds of tons of stuff to the moon. Like in this case, 600 tons of cargo to the moon, which is, it's kind of mind blowing. Like 600 tons of cargo to the moon in a single flight is more cargo than humanity has ever launched to orbit in a single year up to this point. And so if you think, well, what would that be? That's a good question. What do you put on the moon if you're doing 600 tons? And just to refresh your memory, this is the kind of default human lander system program concept of operations for Artemis. So we've got the Falcon Heavy, which is partially reusable, launching the gateway element that uses solar electric propulsion to go to near retrograde halo orbit of the moon. We've got 3 Vulcans or possibly New Glens launching a transfer descent and ascent element that dock with the gateway. We've got the SLS launching the Orion capsule to the gateway. And because the gateway is in this weird halo orbit, there's a phasing requirement. So these launches can only occur 1 or 2 days per month. And then the SLS, it turns into a $2 billion rocket on the seabed after a single use. And then the crew transfer into the ascent stage. They fly to low lunar orbit, ditch the transfer stage, land on the surface with less than 12 tons of cargo capacity. And then they stay there for a couple of days, and then they turn around and fly back to the gateway, go back to the Orion, and fly the Orion back to Earth. Seems complicated. In contrast, the Artemis and Starship, I should say an Artemis and Starship concept is 200 and so, or 300 tons or so of cargo transferred in orbit to a single lunar Starship that's used expendably to move that cargo to the lunar surface with, I wrote here 12, but the Starship is already lighter than it was when I did this calculation. So 8 reusable fully tanker flights would be adequate. And then crew launch, and then another 8 reusable tanker flights flies that to the moon with 25 tons of net mass plus 320 tons plus a lunar surface hab. So if you had, say, 10 crew on board this, they could live there for 3 months without a problem. And with another 320 tons of stuff, they could all have their own personalized moon rover, and more space to deal with than people who live at the South Pole. And they could live there for years, constrained really only by physiological limits rather than by mass limits or like running out of food. And then when it's done, it turns around and flies back to low Earth orbit, where this is a lunar Starship lacking fins and stuff. Lacking flaps, the crew transfers to a regular Starship that then lands them back on Earth. And so unlike the kind of default concept of operations where you've got, 1, 2, 3, or possibly 4 different launch systems, 3 of which don't currently work, a gateway, a transfer descent element, and Orion, that's 5 different spacecraft, of which currently 1 has ever flown in space and didn't work properly. And then multiple transfer, docking, crew type transitions. There's just a single spacecraft with a variant that just involves deleting some parts. And that's it. And every single part of this is in principle reusable, although the lunar surface hab in this case would not be coming back to Earth. So I think it's really compelling, just kind of how much complexity this design takes out. Mars applications is kind of what it was designed around in the first place. So again, we do the whole low Earth orbit refueling thing, flies to Mars. It uses its capability to land on, to use atmosphere to slow down, lands on Mars with a couple 100 tons of stuff. It has a chemical plant on the surface that produces methane and oxygen from ambient water and carbon dioxide, refuels, takes a while, and then flies back to Earth. Again, far simpler than any other concept. It's far simpler than Mars Direct, single stage return. It's far simpler than the system that was used in Andy Weir's book, The Martian, which is mathematically rigorous. It's far simpler than any other serious contender for Mars exploration architecture. Incidentally, you could do Mars sample return like this as well. There's no need to have humans on board. This is kind of esoteric, but I just kind of talk about launch windows and pork chop plots and stuff. So this is the reason that you can only launch to Mars every 2 and a bit years. I think I'll skip this for now. And then this is talking about entry, descent, and landing. And the kind of salient point here is that the Mars rovers represent more or less the limit of what's possible to land on Mars in terms of mass if you're using a blunt body reentry system, because it has a fairly low lift to drag ratio of maybe 0.25. But the Starship is able to actually use its body side on as a lifting body and generate a lift to drag ratio of perhaps 2 or 3, which means that it can enter this horizontal flight phase at a higher altitude with more mass on board without smashing into the surface, which is a definite plus. And in fact, it'll come in so fast because it'll be on a fast transfer orbit that when it first enters the atmosphere, it'll be upside down relative to this picture, because it'll need to use its lift to stay closer to the planet instead of shooting back off into space. And then as it slows down, it'll spin around and use its lift to maintain altitude as it continues to burn off speed, which is pretty neat. And again, designed in from scratch to be able to do this. And then, here's an image of it taking off to fly back to Earth. It turns out that that if you need another Starship, it's probably easier just to make another one on Earth than to fly one back from the Moon or to fly one back from Mars. And it turns out that the cost kind of cutoff for that is somewhere around $200 million. So if it's more expensive to build a Starship than $200 million, it's cheaper to fly one back from the Moon and use it again than to just make another one. But everything I've seen suggests that the current Starlink unit cost is way cheaper than $200 million. And so it's more likely that if you need more Starships, we'll just build more factories for them here on Earth. And then obviously this is the final idea, the final concept, which is this terraformed Mars thing. And I'll just take a quick break here to have a look at the actual terraformed Mars. So this is a project I did a few years ago where I did a full planetary scale hydrological simulation. And then and you can download the file for this from somewhere on my website and dump it into Google Earth yourself. It's about 20 gigs. And then you can zoom in and click around and see which craters end up having waterfront, which ones don't. So I think it's kind of neat. The mistake that you see, particularly with the version of this that you can see in the cafeteria at SpaceX, is that most artists think there's a lot more water on Mars. And so you end up with oceans that are much larger. I don't think there's quite that much water, but there's still enough to have some large lakes and oceans and rivers and things, some waterfalls. So anyway, I thought that would be worth showing you. Let's go back to the talk. All right, so the final section I'm going to talk about really is infrastructure. So like the plan for SpaceX, if you like, is to build a nation on the Moon, to build a nation on Mars. to put logistics below the API so that it feels and works like like Amazon Prime. Right? It's kind of click a button and 100 tons of stuff shows up. You don't have to worry about making everything as a custom one-off out of titanium so that it's light enough. It becomes a conveyor belt of space. And so the appropriate analogy is not something like Hillary and Tenzing climbing Everest back in the 50s, and you kind of eking out this narrow win by the skin of their teeth. The appropriate analogy is the Berlin airlift, in which Allied forces transported 2.3 million tons, which is about what we need on Mars, into Berlin in 1948 and in over 15 months. And they were averaging around 3,000 flights per day, which is about one every 30 seconds. And these DC-3s were capable of transporting 3.5 tons per flight. So Starship is much more capable than a DC-3 in terms of its cargo capacity, although it looks similar. It's nice and shiny. But it doesn't just have to fly in from France. It has to fly to another planet that's 100 million miles away. So that's kind of where the analogy breaks down. But really, we need to think of, operating the Mars transportation system like this. You have a whole row of Starships that are just getting loaded and unloaded from trucks. And then they all take off, and one after the next, they just keep landing at Berlin airport and dropping off all their stuff and then turning around and coming back, or whatever the case may be. So instead of having a heroic Mark Watney individually growing plants in a greenhouse, which is kind of the typical frontier, outdoorsman story that we tell here in the United States, by analogy to the 40 acres and a mule, subsistence farmer kind of origin legend story for the United States. Again, not entirely reflected in reality. We have giant industrial facilities, like this gigantic oil and gas refinement plant, or this illustration that my friend Santiago did for me of a giant tensile structure full of big machinery and people and spaces and planets and cool, like, post-cubist art architecture. It's really a very large scale kind of concept. So the final piece of the puzzle is, the Starship is the hard part, really. Like, the ability to transport a huge amount of stuff cheaply from Earth to Mars is the hard part. And Starship is going to need payload to do that, right? And now SpaceX could fairly easily, I would say, given the capabilities of their team, develop all this stuff themselves and build it. But it shouldn't be necessary. And I think it would be faster if other major industrial companies said, oh, look at that. You no longer need to be as clever as JPL to build a Mars rover, because we no longer have to make the whole thing 900 kilograms. We can just take our existing machinery and upgrade the seals a bit and put in some low temperature lubricants and a vacuum compatible hydraulic power pack, and we're good to go. So Earth to Caterpillar, Boeing, Lockheed, DuPont, any of these companies, there's hundreds of them. Do you read me? It's time to start thinking about spooling up an internal R&D team, which is cheap in the grand scale of what your business does, even compared to your recruitment budget, and coming to the table with a technically credible piece of the lunar or Mars base puzzle. And then Elon Musk and SpaceX might leave your industry alone. He might not verticalize in your industry and figure out how to do it for a tenth the cost and take your business away from you. So build out a space division that's focused on iterating real hardware, and then the recruitment and retention difficulties that all these companies face will go away, right? All the cool, young, talented engineers coming out of school want to go and work at Tesla and SpaceX. They don't want to go and work for fuddy-duddy old Boeing or whatever, because it's pretty clear to them that the interns are getting to work on cooler stuff at SpaceX than any new guy gets to work on at any of these other companies. And so, I feel like if these other companies kind of, in a enclosed environment, adapted this design methodology and structure and zeitgeist, this idea that they could really improve their own business as well. There's a lot of upside. And so these are the 9 key pieces that are needed to build a base on the inside of which you can use more or less off-the-shelf industrial parts, like bits of factories and pumps and stuff like that. But you still need to build a terrarium. You still need to build a system that enables humans to live in this environment without dying. And those parts are a solar farm to produce gigawatts of power, an air miner to distill CO2, nitrogen, and water from the Mars atmosphere, a water miner to produce huge quantities of water, because ultimately we will succeed if we can minimize our constraints. And And one constraint is water availability. And so like a closed system recycling 20 tons of water is great, but a well that's capable of producing 100,000 tons of water a day is much better. We need rock mining. We need the ability to extract aggregate and ore from places on Mars. In some cases, very remote from the original base. We need a fuel plant that's capable of producing methane and oxygen and also industrial hydrocarbons for lubricants and fuel in unlimited quantities. We're talking like something that makes a typical Louisiana oil refinery look quite small. And it has to do synthetic production of these hydrocarbons from atmospheric CO2, which sounds a lot like what we kind of need to do on Earth to deal with climate change. Interesting. Maybe setting up a business in this space could make money on Earth as well as being useful on Mars. We need life support machinery. We can't just kind of take a system out of a nuclear submarine and put it on a Mars base. We need something that's like a little bit better. We need heavy machinery telerobotics so that people are able to operate, very, very large cranes and telehandlers and diggers and stuff without being physically present in the cab of that thing. This is a technology that already exists. Rio Tinto is a mining company in Australia that set up completely automated mines in Western Australia. We need pressure structures, essentially ways of producing pressurized volumes on the surface. And everyone says, "Oh, I'll build domes or something." I'm in general very much in favor of building enormous pressurized volumes using pressure stabilized tensile membranes, just so you can enclose like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres of volume. And so you don't have to deal with, Tetrising everything together to make it fit. You just say, "Oh, you want to spool up a factory to build ball bearings? Here's 1 million square feet, get cracking." And then of course, spacesuits. So let's head to the Q&A. All right, so if people who had questions in the chat can move them over to the Q&A, then I will I'll head to that. Does that sound reasonable, Ken?
Yeah, excellent. And they can speak out if they like. I think some of them already enabled or muted, but it's better they click raise hand so we know the sequence. But if you want to call on somebody, in this to speak out, I think Dave has some question in the hour. Mr. Grover, he was talking about the solar power system. So maybe he can share his views and everything. And Dr. Comex, Max, also have something he'd like to share. Looks like. Oh, maybe Al. Al, okay. Please speak out. Al?
Oh, you're talking to me?
Yes, Mr.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
I actually have two questions. One is what's your take on space solar power? And the other one is that if you launch enough, you're going to damage the atmosphere. Any idea of where that limitation is?
Yeah. Space-based solar power is a tricky one. Thanks, Brad. For the basic reason that if you take Starlink, for example, Starlink satellites generate about 4.5 kilowatt hours of power per orbit, and they transmit a certain amount of data to Earth, which earns them a certain amount of revenue. And the revenue of them transmitting microwaves to Earth containing data is like 1 million times higher than if they were just to transmit that power that they'd received as microwaves and turn it into electricity. So it seems fairly clear to me that sending microwaves with data on them is much more lucrative. In fact, it's lucrative enough that you can make money doing it as a communication satellite. But fundamentally, electricity on the surface of the Earth is just incredibly cheap. And I've run the numbers on this. I have a couple of blogs on it that you can delve into if you're interested, that show that there's basically no way to do that in space and then transmit the power to Earth and make money. It may be possible actually to do it the other way around. You could transmit power from Earth to space and use it there rather than having a giant solar array for, say, a space station or a moon base. But that's kind of more marginal. In terms of atmospheric damage, well, the Starship exhaust products are carbon dioxide and water vapor, which are fairly benign compared to other rockets. And obviously the carbon dioxide is contributes to global warming. But if it came to the point that launches of Starship were contributing, anything like, say, aviation's contribution to atmospheric carbon dioxide, I think we'd be in a place which would be I mean, just wild, just wild. The total amount of fuel that the Starship uses per launch is equivalent to like a small town's total consumption of gasoline. It's really in the noise. Okay, heading over to question and answer. It really helps me if you type your answers there, and I can read them and answer them as I go along. So Victor wrote, I logged in late. What stage of development is the Starship? I kind of already covered that, but as of now, they have answering that now. As of now, Starship, they are kind of putting the finishing touches on Booster 5 and serial number 20 Starship, and they're going to do the orbital test launch in the coming months, pending a FAA environmental review. So I think it'll get to the point where they're able to demonstrate that the Starship system is capable of doing orbital launch and re-entry and landing in the coming year. But I would expect to see that the design continues to evolve from there. Ken, can you mute yourself, please?
Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah.
Thanks. Brad Neuberg wrote, what role do you see for autonomous systems in space to build lunar and Mars cities? I'm a machine learning software engineer, so I'm wondering where you see these skills being applied once we have Starship's abilities online. I think it would be amazing if we were able to build truly useful autonomous systems that were able to build lunar bases and Mars bases. And I think that's definitely part of the overall system, because really, in terms of like the productivity of labor, there'll be a huge labor shortage on Mars, and so we'll need people to become steadily more productive, like 1% more productive per day or something like that for decades at a time. And it's really only possible to do that by adding more layers of abstraction between the actual atoms getting fiddled with in a factory and the people who are pressing the buttons to make it happen. And a good analogy for this is the development of software compilers over time. So like it's pretty rare nowadays to find software engineers who are actively like manipulating bits, but it's pretty common for them to use an interpreted or a compiled language, which is like many levels of abstraction above the bare metal. Dana N says, what about larger 1 megawatt heat pipe reactors, space nukes? I think nuclear power would be very useful on Mars, but I think that putting it on the critical path is asking for trouble. Jeffrey Greenblatt says, I'm curious about price trajectories for Starship. Where do you think it will be initially, cargo and crew versions, and when do you think it will get to the $2 million a launch number Elon's quoted? Well, there's a difference here between kind of all-up cost and marginal cost. So really, when you're thinking of the Starship launch cost as a business, you have to divide the total cost of development and of construction and of launch operations by whatever the person's paying or how many launches you're able to achieve. But I think ultimately you can kind of throw development costs away and just kind of turn it into long-term debt. And then it becomes the question of like, how many launches do you get per Starship, and then you can kind of amortize the cost of constructing it. And so I think that the functional constraint here is not really the cost of the launch, but it's how quickly we can fill up Starships and launch them. I think that at this point, Starship is going to need payloads more than it needs, more than the expense is stopping payloads from occurring, if that makes any sense. Brad Norberg says, any Black Swan predictions you might make that would affect the predictions you've made? Generally speaking, I'm actually very optimistic about the future, and I think that there's a lot of very clever people who are doing a lot of thinking about problems that humanity as a whole is going to encounter, and making positive changes to help them. Obviously, it's hard to control for people being silly who have access to nuclear weapons, but I guess we can continue to cross our fingers and hope for the best. James Jutila says, as far as in situ resources on Mars, do they have resources like thorium and uranium to build nuclear power plants? Yeah, they do. I mean, Mars is made of atoms, same as Earth. I think it's probably a bit of a stretch to say that you're guaranteed to find concentrated ores on Mars, because Mars's geological processes are far less mature than Earth's, and so it may be the case that for items that have extremely high value per mass, which thorium and uranium are definitely in that category, it'll be cheaper to import them from Earth than to produce them locally on Mars. But we could always find an asteroid out the back that's made of uranium, and then that wouldn't be the case anymore. Okay, I'm running out of open questions here.
There's a couple of questions I want to speak out. Dennis, go ahead.
Hello, Doctor. I was wondering if you heard from Elon Musk that they can't build an 18-meter rocket, that 9 meter is pretty much at the limit as to what they can build. Does that change at all your projections for how soon we can industrialize both low Earth orbit and the moon and Mars?
Well, personally, I think 18 meters is probably possible, but no, I think 9 meters is adequate. Unless you have a particular payload that's wider than that. But you could always make a slightly wider fairing. One of the nice things about the stainless steel structural design is that it's much simpler to analyze and construct if you need to do a variation. So if you need to make a slightly longer one or a slightly wider one, with a conical section, it's called frustrum connecting the two, then that's reasonably straightforward. So anyway, I don't think that really changes much. If it turned out that was what changed things, that'd be pretty cool. I'll put it that way. Like if it turns out that a few thousand launches of a 9 meter Starship isn't adequate to do what we need, then that would imply that we've done a few thousand launches of a 9 meter Starship, and that would be pretty neat.
Yeah, I think Mr. James Sloan has a question. So James, go ahead.
I was wondering about with their Hyperloop experience, how quickly do you see building a mass driver on the moon?
That's a good question. So you could build a mass driver on the moon, same as you can build one anywhere. The question is why? And I think your question kind of presupposes that the audience has some knowledge of either Hyland's book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, or O'Neill's book about using mass drivers to transport partially processed lunar ore to space stations nearby for processing. And I think both of those are pretty unlikely long term. But I would have to be wrong. I'd love to be wrong.
You are.
Yeah, I think that if it turns out the mass drivers are the best way of getting material that we need off the moon, that'd be cool. And in particular, I think that's probably more sensible than processing lunar water to turn it into fuel and oxidizer, and then using that to launch from the moon. But I think long term, the moon is so close to Earth that it would probably be easier just to move stuff up from Earth to get to it. But again, I don't know. I have no way of knowing, and I would love to find out.
Yeah, I think Brad has a question. Brad, go ahead. You can speak out. And Dave next.
Sure. I was wondering, so, obviously you focused on surface settlement so far, but I'm just wondering what kind of opinions or analysis you have on asteroid mining and resource use. And then of course, the kind of O'Neill vision as an extension of that, just from kind of an analytical level or opinion level.
Thanks, Brad. That's a very interesting question. And yeah, I've written a couple of blogs on this as well. It's a tough one because it turns out that there are a handful of materials on the Earth that are so expensive. We're talking like $50,000 a kilogram or $50,000 a gram or something like that. That the cost of transporting them from an asteroid back to Earth or something is relatively small compared to the cost of the material itself. But the critical fact that's often missed by people who say, oh, well, if we find an asteroid that's full of palladium or something, we can make money, is that part of the reason that it's so expensive on Earth is that our industrial processes have really low demand for it. And so no one has ever gotten around to building a decent palladium mine, right? Or a decent extraction system. And if that suddenly became like critical path for, say, the electrical vehicle industry or the or computer industry or something like that, then the price would come down really quickly, as it has in the past for other materials that were previously pretty esoteric with low consumption rates, essentially demanded by a handful of government research labs or something, and then became on the critical path for something that was very important. And the second reason that that's important is that aside from the fact that we don't know of any palladium asteroids, the part of the reason that they're expensive is that they're really scarce. And so I was going to say, like, there's two separate problems here. One is that the market is really small, right? So even though that the dollar per kilogram is quite high, the overall dollars per year is really low, and in particular, much lower than you'd need to go to space. And the other problem is that the dollars per kilogram is high because they're scarce. And so if you suddenly have a demand for them, which means that that previous number, the dollars per year, is high, then that cost would come down and you'd have no business case. And the other problem is that if the dollars per year stays high because still no one wants it, and then you go and get an asteroid that's full of it and you bring it back to Earth, then suddenly the supply goes through the roof and the cost necessarily decreases, unless you can do something like De Beers and maintain a monopoly on your supply of a palladium asteroid. So I think that asteroid mining is pretty out there. I don't think it's like a particularly good business case. However, there's two important caveats to that. One is that obviously the ability to go to asteroids and move them around is incredibly important in terms of planetary protection and stopping them from smashing us when inevitably we find one that's going to hit us. And the second is that if you are building a space station in deep space or on an asteroid, then obviously getting to the asteroid and being able to mine it, process it, is extremely important. It so happens that my personal view is that it's much easier to do the big space city thing on a surface of a planet. I disagree with O'Neill in that regard. But if you are at an asteroid, then obviously mining it is a good idea. Dave Nordling says, can you provide a further treatment of propellant transfer technology in a later segment? The reality, Dave, is I don't know much about it. When someone does something about it, then I can write about it and maybe help communicate that to a more general audience. But I think the reality is very few people know much about in-space propellant transfer. If it does exist. It has been done. The Russians have done it for many years. It is possible. It's not forbidden by the laws of physics. And I suspect that's, if it turns out that that's the really hard problem for SpaceX to solve, that would be very surprising to me.
Can you hear me, Dr. Handmer?
Sorry, who's that?
This is Dave Nordling. I'm sorry.
Oh,
I
yes.
finally
Sorry.
figured out how to unmute myself. Thank you for your presentation. I'm very sorry if I came off overly negative.
No, not at all.
I really think challenging assumptions is important for the discourse, and I thank you for at least you've succeeded in one facet that you're right. A lot of thinking has been very small, and Starship is indeed a very big deal. But as a career engineer, I can tell you there's a lot of things that should be in this universe, and they are not. They are
Yes.
a lot harder, more expensive, take a lot more time, and I completely support you in your goal to counteract a lot of the misconceptions in space journalism. But I think unbridled optimism is not helpful. So I certainly hope that you and I can converse in later iterations. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I did want to send my thanks for your presentation today.
Thanks, Brad. No, I will insist on my optimism being strictly bridled from now on. I think when I wrote the blog initially 2 years ago, I think there was a lot of potential showstoppers that really hadn't been explored yet. And one of the exciting things about watching this in real time is you see that SpaceX is thinking the same thing. And they're like, okay, what is the worst thing that could happen to us today? Let's understand that problem. Let's retire it. Let's understand the problem. Let's retire it. Let's understand. And the really exciting thing about it is that they're approaching this problem like A, they're spending their own money, and B, they intend to succeed, which is a really kind of profound contrast to the other major NASA flagships, which have been operated by, frankly, profiteering private contractors exploiting contracts that they've written to treat them as cash cows and not to approach the problems like they intend to succeed. They're approaching the problem like they intend to make as much money as possible.
I would caution you against that broad brush assumption, though.
Yes,
I think it's important not to be pejorative in your assessment. I know a lot of people have that opinion, but I can assure you that is not the case. Companies that work for profit, they charge what they need to charge, because the most important thing is decades later, they're still in business.
I understand. And like, no, I'm not saying that Northrop Grumman should operate JWST for charity. Like, and I think that my readers are accustomed to the usual level of subtlety that I'm able to inject here, which is that I'm not here to attack any individuals, especially not the engineers who work on these programs, who I have nothing but admiration for. But it is fairly clear that if you look at these systems, from a broad systems level, that they are not functioning as well as they potentially could. And if that was not the case, then we would not have these situations where the people whose only job it is to estimate what the costs and the schedule will be are so out of step with the reality of what the cost and schedule actually are. And that reflects the fact that there's obviously some deep structural concern or problem or inefficiency in the way that these programs have been executed historically. I think that's been recognized. I think major steps have been taken to try and right the ship slightly as far as future contract development goes. And it'll be very interesting for me to see and for everyone to see how successful they are in ensuring that programs are actually delivering value to their constituents at in a timely and kind of expeditious way. But yeah, I take your point, and I don't want anyone to come away from this thinking that I've just kind of being grumpy. The whole point of this blog series was to kind of focus on constructive and productive ways of talking about these things.
Dr. Handmer, next, I think we can let Mr. Guido Frassinelli to speak out. He's our AIAA member, more than 70 years of membership. He's an amazing gentleman. So Guido, go ahead. Mr. Frassinelli, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, you answered this question before I joined the meeting, but what's the thrust of the first stage?
You put me on the spot there. I know off the top of my head that the thrust weight ratio is 1.5. And I think the thrust of each engine is about 30 tons and there's about 30 engines. So it's probably about, that doesn't seem right, 300 tons. There's 30 engines, about 9,000 tons of thrust. Yeah, that sounds about right. But don't quote me on that. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
How many tons?
About 9,000.
Okay.
Maybe say over 9,000.
Yeah, so maybe this won't be practical, but I have a colleague that can build a booster using fan jet engines, because they can multiply the thrust of the fan engines by a certain technique that he uses with little winglets. And in some cases, maybe not on a Starship, but on smaller boosters, you can use these as the first stage by gagging them and multiplying the thrust that comes from the engine by at least twice, maybe 3 times, and use this ganged set of engines as a first stage, because it can reduce the size of the first stage that's being used to launch quite a few vehicles.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the air launch vehicles like Spaceship 2 or White Knight 2 and the one that we had to talk about just the other day, Stratolaunch, use lift. They use turbofan engines, they use wings to help them leave the surface of the Earth. I'm personally a little dubious about the utility of those systems for like large scale launch systems, just because like 6,000 tons is a lot of cargo for a plane. But certainly, higher efficiency systems are worth exploring.
Well, the advantage is that you have the specific impulse is so much greater than that of rocket engines. It's about 20 times greater than that.
That's exactly right.
At sea level, so between sea level and 40 and 50,000 feet, it's a great assist, and you can use a lot less fuel to get up to that altitude.
Yeah, except you have 92 more miles to go.
Well, that's all right, but you make you make your first stage a little of the rocket smaller. You can make it cheaper that way. You use less rocket fuel.
Thank you, Guido.
Victor might want to speak out. Victor, he click raise hand. Is that okay, Victor?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, yeah. So this is kind of far out fetched, but there's a lot of talk about the efforts to go to Mars and stuff and perform work on Mars and all this life support systems you'll need to work on Mars. But has there ever been a great research study or project that anyone has performed to see if it's a possibility of transforming the atmosphere of Mars into a breathable atmosphere for human life, human support? I mean, does it possible? Are there any conditions on Mars in any phase of Mars's transposition around the sun that would allow the production of organic materials or whatever you might want to use to produce oxygen, and to, I don't know if it'd be an unstable thing or not, but to transform, actually change the atmosphere on Mars to actually, you could be like a low level atmosphere, not nothing.
Yeah. So the simple answer is yes. Many people have looked into terraforming. The best recent paper that I know of about it is by Margarita Marinova, who's actually one of the Starship designers as well. So terraforming includes basically with Mars, you have to warm it up a bit, and then you have to thicken the atmosphere so that you can at least walk around with the face mask on instead of a spacesuit. In terms of Mars having, I think you could generate a warm, wet, and poisonous Mars atmosphere reasonably quickly, like a few hundred years maybe. In generating a breathable atmosphere is much more challenging because because Mars is further from the sun. It has to have a much stronger greenhouse effect, and if you reduce the carbon dioxide to non-toxic levels in the Mars atmosphere, it will get too cold. So it becomes quite a complicated problem there. But I look forward to my great grandchildren working on that.
I hope so. Thanks.
Jeffrey answered the gentleman's question about super heavy thrust at 7,500 tons. So I was off by 20%, which as a former astrophysicist, I will take. Thanks, Jeffrey. Randall says, can you get a similar cost per kilogram launch cost in a smaller launch vehicle with Raptor engines? Does the cost efficiency scale smaller? A little bit, yeah. I mean, it turns out that that up to a certain point, larger rockets have a better mass fraction. And if you look at, for instance, the mass fraction, which is the cargo mass divided by the total mass of very small rockets like Rocket Lab's Electron, it's like 0.5%. And then if the Saturn V is about 4%. So it's almost 10 times more mass per rocket mass or per fuel mass. But the other thing is that having a huge payload fairing size is important for very large payloads. One of the things that makes things like JWST so expensive is that the whole thing has to fold up in origami style to fit into the Atlas V fairing. But if the fairing is much larger, then you have to fold it less, and it's easier and cheaper to do that. So
Ariane 5.
Sorry, did I say Ariane 5? Atlas 5? Ariane 5. Damn. Yeah, slip of the tongue. Thank you. Isn't that wild? Ariane 5, I think, had its first flight after JWST program started, and I'm reasonably sure that the JWST will be the last launch of the Ariane 5. I may be wrong about that, but it's certainly like it's towards the far end of that program. So like the entire life cycle of the Atlas V rocket is smaller than the entire time it's taken to build JWST, or at least it's in the same ballpark. So big rockets, I think, is the way to go. The risk with building giant rockets is to find that you have no payload for them. And that was certainly the issue that the Saturn V would have had going forward if they had not canceled it. But I think that problem is partly ameliorated if the overall launch cost of the giant rocket is less than any other rocket, including the really small ones. So if, for example, it costs $5 million to launch a Starship, that's the same as it costs to launch a Rocket Lab Electron, which is, it's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah, Dave, Mr. Nording raised hand.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point just now, Jamie, Casey, I'm sorry, that larger rockets do ultimately have a better cost structure, but their penalty is in the capital. That's the reason why a lot of companies are building small rockets today, is
Yes.
not because they don't see the value in it and they don't see that things scale better. I think that's been known for decades, but the trouble is that I've got to go to the private investor pool and I've got to ask for $3 billion for the first year to start my program, and I'll never get a hit. But if I go say, look, I can build this cheap microsat launcher out of existing technology and I'll be flying in 3 years. And oh, by the way, I'm going to build a brand new engine. And all I need is $10 million. There'll be lots of takers and lots of failures.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
that's I think the existing launch market is an adequate and accurate reflection of the realities. And SpaceX is to be lauded for taking on such a large, exorbitantly large project. My criticisms are largely squared around the fact that there's a lot of ifs. I think your presentation has at least 4 critical ifs in it, or miracles. In physicist speak, I suppose you call them miracles, but in the engineering world, we call them critical ifs.
Yes.
You're about 4 deep, and any one of them means game over. And so yeah, good. You bring an excellent point.
No,
but I think
I agree completely.
Capital is the key.
Yeah,
to
I agree
why
completely.
there aren't more large launchers. That's why ULA doesn't build larger ones. They build them exactly as large as what they think they can get away with the capital that they think they have. They're not these established aerospace companies. They're not dumb, not by any stretch of the imagination.
No, I agree completely. I think it's important to note that the various rocket startups are kind of learning their lessons and blowing up rockets on smaller rockets, which is cheaper. And all those rockets have the same basic guidance systems and so on, but almost all of them have a plan to build, a Falcon 9 class rocket down the track if their initial one takes off. So we've seen that already with Electron and with Firefly and so on, that they've all got kind of a plan to build a bigger one down the track. So yeah, I agree completely on the kind of the cost structure for spooling up a team and a set of competencies in that area. And I don't think anyone should set out to build Starship as their first project out of school. And I also completely agree, for the record, with your kind of, you need 3 or 4 more miracles for Starship to work properly. And at JPL they say, if you've got a flagship class mission, you can have at most 2 miracles, because each miracle costs 2 years and $200 million or something to make sure it happens. So we'll see if that happens. Thanks, Dennis, for your input there. And then so Randall's asking about like maybe a half-size Starship or something. And he's drawing it. Sorry, Randall says, I'm wondering about the future market for large-size payloads. I wonder if, from a commercial perspective, whether a half-size version of the Starship might be more viable long-term. There are a lot more 767 freighter aircraft than 747 freighter aircraft. Yeah, you're 100% right about that. Particularly now. However, I would be cautious of drawing an analogy too closely there, because ultimately the size constraints of aircraft are determined by things like existing runway sizes and ground support equipment, in addition to typical distances that aircraft cargo has to fly. So that's it would be unwise, I think, to stretch the analogy there too far. And I think if SpaceX was being run by like a board of institutional investors, they would have shut down Starship a long time ago, because Starship is explicitly built to essentially destroy its own market and collapse its profit margins and put 1 million tons on Mars, which frankly no capital provider cares about. But because it's Elon, he's able to be like, oh, and I guess at the same time, we'll totally revolutionize the internet industry. And that's maybe good enough for Sequoia or whoever came along to help fund its development. So I think it's just a nice confluence of kind of coincidences here, which mean that building something of this magnitude is and scale of ambition is conceivable. Victor says, is the entire stack made of stainless steel? As far as I know, yes.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to ask. So the entire stack is made of stainless steel. So I know these calculations have been performed previously, and you may have covered this subject in this presentation. But is this the ISP? Is it enough to produce enough delta? So the delta V, this ISP produces the delta V. Is that enough to lock this up into a low Earth orbit with no effort? I mean, are those engines that efficient where they can actually, because stainless steel is pretty heavy. And they already done calculations for that.
Yeah, so one of the advantages of going to a larger rocket is that the overall percentage of the width of the rocket that is stainless steel is less. And I know that there's some mechanical engineers in the audience who'll be like, but you're used to say, I know. The nice thing about stainless steel is that its mechanical properties are much more stable at low and high temperatures, which it will have to endure as part of its flight plan, in ways that conventional rockets have not had to in the same way, and is also much easier to weld than the lithium aluminium alloys that they build the rockets out of, like the Falcon 9.
Right.
I mean, it's like ideally you just kind of pick a material that's infinitely strong and whatnot. But yeah, taking that into account, the overall mass of the Starship, according to Elon in the most recent interview, is around about 100 tons. And that's a moving target. Like that.
And it will be reusable. Is that right? They'll return that first stage back?
Yeah. The booster stage comes back as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Storm, he clicked raise hand. James.
Question about the launch costs. Everything focuses on reusability, but the government budget office.
Can you speak louder?
Sorry, I can't hear you properly.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. There was a government budget office report regarding the shuttle that the key problem was personnel costs. Becomes a question of the flight rate because personnel costs are amortized over a 1-year period. And do you have any idea how many people are involved in the Starship's flight?
Yeah, I don't really know, and I think there are probably other people who are doing much more granular estimates, cost based on observations of how many cars are in the parking lot or something like that. If you have a program that has a fixed number of employees, regardless of launch cadence, then yeah, the amortized launch cost becomes quite high. But I feel like that's also more common in legacy systems, and in particular, Elon's point of view is oriented a lot towards automation of stuff. So for example, the number of people who are on console during a Falcon 9 launch is much, much smaller than you would see in almost any other launch system. And I would only expect to see that trend continue. And so the hope there is that the number of people that are working on this system is mostly proportional to the number of launches rather than kind of an independent overhead that has to be divided up. I've got to run in a few minutes, so let's take a few more questions, and then I'll have to say goodbye. But it's been really wonderful. Thank you for coming and having a chat.
I really highly appreciate it.
I can probably take 3 more questions and then head out.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, I saw you want to say something. Andrew.
Yeah.
Mr. Citizen.
Thanks, and so much. Thank you so much, Casey, for your time today. Really great discussion. I just had a quick question. If you have any thoughts on SpaceX's acquisition of Swarm, and what your thoughts might be on whether or not they might integrate an IoT capability into Starlink, or any thoughts you might have there.
Well, I know Sarah, and who's the co-founder of Swarm, and it's very exciting for them to see that their bet in that direction. The value of their contribution recognized by such a major industry player, and I don't really know much more about it than that, but I think that SpaceX has stated that their mission is they're going to basically own the backbone of the internet sooner or later. And I think that orbital IoT connectivity is an important part of that. But I think that if you are a SpaceX executive and you're looking at other companies that are executing in the space, that if you could buy the team that built Swarm, you'd be doing really, really well. So I think it's a really, really great piece of news.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
I think James Jutila, do you want to say something? And I heard Tasha Dana seems to have some question earlier. Oh, okay. James is not going to say something. Tasha, do you want to repeat your question again earlier? Okay, then KH, you raised a question, but it was. Do you want to speak up?
I've got Tasha's question here, which is, what's your take on anneal cylinders? How Starships are a step forwards towards that? I kind of addressed that in the low Earth orbit applications slide. The challenge with anneal cylinders, and actually I was very interested to see that documentary that came out recently about Jared Anneal and his vision there, is that in his book he says, well, obviously this is a solution looking for a problem. What's the problem? The problem is power. We've got this kind of occurring Malthusian catastrophe. This is in the early 1970s. We're going to need a lot of space-based solar power. We can make that more cheaply in space. We can build giant space factories. Millions of people can work up there. Problem solved. Well, in 2021, which is almost 50 years later, we know that that's not really the case. We did not see a Malthusian catastrophe in terms of population or energy demand. We've seen costs of terrestrial energy continue to fall, and indeed are today falling faster than they've ever fallen before, which is an indicator to me that we're kind of still at the early stages of making energy really cheap for humanity. And we've also seen like the costs of doing stuff in space have not become cheaper in ways that we might have expected. In particular, O'Neill published his book before the launch of the shuttle and kind of anticipated cost improvements similar to the ones that we expect now with Starship, almost 50 years later. And so I think that Starship provides one essential part of the overall picture, which is the ability to move a lot of mass into orbit quite cheaply. And I know several different teams that are working on, like designing and building next generation space stations that are built on the Starship architecture. But that still doesn't answer the other question, which is, what is the killer app? What is the problem that you're actually solving? What is the thing that people will pay you money to solve that makes it worthwhile to do this? And we do actually have, as I mentioned, good examples of large research laboratories in Antarctica and other places where the per person per day cost is on the order of thousands of dollars, and certainly industrial research facilities easily into that cost range. So you could sort of envision large space stations that are being used for research. But in terms of manufacturing, I don't think we're quite at that cost level yet. And I don't really know of like a manufacturing facility which could justify the expense of building in low Earth orbit to serve an Earth-based market. Like obviously there are some advantages to building factories in low Earth orbit that you can't get on the surface of the Earth. But the differences are like, there's a really, really strong incentive to solve whatever the problem is that you can't solve on Earth, because it's so much cheaper to do things here. So it might be that it's slightly easier to grow good crystals in low Earth orbit. Well, yes, that's fine, but your budget is now $500 million to figure out how to do as good enough on Earth. And throughout the history of the modern age, we basically found that people have been able to find ways of doing stuff on Earth. So it'll be interesting to see. And then last question.
Yeah, last question. KH, I saw you post a question.
Yeah, I had a
to...
question. Sure, I'll go ahead. Yes, you'd mentioned that SpaceX likes to control its own assets, not be reliant on external ones. What about ground stations? Are they building their own Earth ground stations to talk to the Starship, or are they using existing assets from commercial, et cetera?
I don't know the specifics, but I think it is talked about in their FCC application because they handle that kind of bandwidth communication stuff. And I know that SpaceX uses, you can find websites and stuff from their various suppliers, like they use antennas and stuff made by third-party suppliers. But I do know that SpaceX is investing heavily in their own Starlink infrastructure, and that Starlink will be capable of communicating with assets in low Earth orbit. I know that the Dragon communicates via the TDRS system, and I know that Dragon has also, they've done Iridium network demonstrations with Dragon. So like it's yeah, there's many different options there. They also have their own ground tracking stations in various places around the world. I'm not precisely sure where. Obviously, they've got a variety of them for Starlink as well. But in terms of ones they use to talk to the Dragon, I would imagine they use NASA assets outside the United States, but I don't actually know.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Coach.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Handmer. Thank you. Yes, thank you so much. Give us extra time. I knew in advance people are very enthusiastic, so I really appreciate it. Sorry to take a long time.
That's fine. 2 hours is about right.
Yeah. So everyone, just let's thank Dr. Handmer for this inspiring discussion and the presentation. Just wonderful. So actually we have more questions, but the time is up. So if you have more questions, you are welcome to contact Dr. Handmer, and also to look at his Twitter and follow up. And also you can let us know, we can try to forward your question. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. So highly appreciate. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Handmer. So please stay in touch, and I wish you can come back and speak to us again. All right. So this concludes today's AIAA Los Angeles section event today. So have a great weekend. See you next time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Woo!
Yeah.